Today we're going to talk about the lymphatic system, a very quiet system that plays a very important role in our body, in which without this system, the cardiovascular system as well as the immune system is going to have a very hard time to actually function. So for today's lecture, you will be required to understand and identify the different components of your lymphatic system, the major trunks and ducts that are involved in the system, as well as the structure of the lymphatic vessel that makes them really unique. And we're also going to look at a lot of lymphoid tissues and the lymph node as well in the second part of the lecture. To understand the lymphatic system, we first need to understand the circulatory system and what is actually happening in the microcirculation, especially at the capillary bed. So a lot of fluid are going to be left behind around your tissue as blood circulates through the capillaries. And if you look at the image here, it is actually showing you the pressure changes that is happening at a capillary. As blood circulates at the capillary ends, there are actually two pressures that is being exerted, which is the hydrostatic and the colloid osmotic pressure. And these high pressures at the arterial ends of the capillary will eventually force plasma fluid to actually leak out from the vessels, and this fluid that leaks out, which mainly consists of water and other solutes such as your glucose, amino acids, electrolytes, or even white blood cells, they are going to leak out to the surrounding tissues. But however, you won't find red blood cells and platelets because these are too large to squeeze through the capillaries, but all the other solutes, they are able to squeeze out. And this fluid will eventually fill up the spaces between the cells, and this is what we call as tissue fluid, or what is known as the interstitial fluid. Okay, so as interstitial fluid fills up the spaces around the capillary, the tissue spaces around the capillary, the pressure within the vessel is also changing. So from a very high pressure arterial end, it's going to become very low pressure towards the venule. And so a lot of these materials that have been squeezed out at the arterial end, that has leaked out, will eventually be reabsorbed back at the venule end. However, the fluid that remains will become what we know as the interstitial fluid, and almost 3 liters are actually produced in a single day. So all this leaked fluid and other plasma proteins that have actually escaped from the bloodstream, they all must be returned to blood. So why do we need to return all this leaked fluid to the blood? Okay, as you know, you only have about 4 to 5 liters of blood. If in a day 3 liters of this fluid from your plasma is going to become your interstitial fluid, then how much of blood volume are you going to have? Because you only have 4 to 5 and 3 is already being left behind in tissues. So if you don't return back the 3 liters that has leaked out, you're not going to have enough blood volume. Okay, so you need to return all this fluid back to your blood so that your cardiovascular system can operate properly, so that you have enough or sufficient blood volume. Okay, so to solve this problem so that your cardiovascular system has enough blood volume, this is where the lymphatic system actually comes in play to help collect back all this excess fluid and return it back to your bloodstream. Because if you don't have enough blood volume, there will not have enough perfusion of oxygen to all your organ systems. Okay, in that way, eventually it's going to cause the entire system to collapse. So this is why the lymphatic system plays a very important role to actually return back all this fluid by collecting them and sending them back to your circulatory system. So if you look back at the image, you can see lymphatic vessels are very closely associated with capillary beds. They run very close to the capillary beds, so that all this fluid, the excess fluid that has come out, the interstitial fluid, is eventually sucked up by the lymphatic vessel and sent back to your circulatory system. Okay, always remember, once interstitial fluid actually enters into the lymphatic vessel, it is no longer called interstitial fluid, it is called as a lymph. Okay, it's a special name. Lymph means clear water. So whatever fluid that is found inside of your lymphatic vessel is known as lymph. Okay, so what is a lymphatic system? Lymphatic system is literally a network of vessels, tissues, and organs. They function mainly to return fluid that have leaked out from the blood vascular system. They are site for immune surveillance because all your immune cells, mostly the lymphocytes, this is where they are going to like play an important role. This is where you'll find them. This is literally like the house for them, and they are also involved in the production of immune cells like your lymph node and all that. They are capable of causing your lymphocytes to proliferate and produce more cells, especially during a cause where there's an infection in the body. And another important function of the lymphatic system is also transporting fat to the circulatory system. So when you look at the components of the lymphatic system, it's literally made out of all these lymphatic vessels as well as the lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs. The vessels play a role in returning the excess fluid in the form of a lymph back to your circulatory system, while the tissues and organ plays a major role in the immune system. Together they form the structural basis of your immune system. So this is literally showing you the lymph flow pathway. And lymph flow is a unidirectional flow. That means wherever it is starting from, the destination is the same. The lymph has to be returned back to the circulatory system and back to the heart. So lymph flow usually starts at the very small capillaries that are found weaved between the blood capillaries. So from lymphatic capillaries, the smaller vessels will pick up all this interstitial fluid, and eventually that becomes what we know as the lymph as it starts flowing inside the vessel. And it will move on to larger collecting vessels. Larger collecting vessels. From the collecting vessels, they eventually pass through many lymph nodes. They actually pass through multiple lymph nodes before draining into one of the major lymph trunks that we have, and eventually return to the lymph duct. We only have two of those big large ducts, and the lymph duct will then drain all this collected lymph fluid into what we know as the venous circulation. So it's going to drain into a vein, and that is going to take all this lymph back to the heart. So this is literally how the lymph actually flows from the capillary bed all the way back to your circulatory system. So the lymphatic system is actually not a closed system, unlike the cardiovascular system where you have a pump, which is the heart, and then a closed circulation where blood goes out from the heart and comes back to the heart. But there is no such thing as a pump or anything in the lymphatic system that actually drives the whole system. So the lymphatic system basically relies on its vessels to ensure that all this interstitial fluid is eventually returned back to the circulation. So the vessels in your lymphatic systems are actually quite unique. So you have the larger lymphatic vessels, which are almost similar to your veins. They are all thin walled, they have low pressure in them, and they also have valves to prevent backflow. They're very similar to veins. And you have the lymphatic capillaries, which are the smaller capillaries that are found very closely associated with the capillary bed of your circulatory system. So the lymphatic capillaries are usually blind-ended, and they are very widespread. You have so many or so much of them. And the interesting part about the lymphatic capillaries, they are remarkably permeable. They're just like sponges that are just waiting to suck up fluids. So they are very, very permeable because of certain unique characteristic that they have in their capillaries. So as you know, the lymphatic vessel is actually a one-way system in which lymph has to flow back only towards the heart, and it actually begins with all these blind-ended microscopic lymphatic capillaries that are actually weaving their way between all the capillary beds and also your body tissues. And these structures are actually very widespread. The capillaries are so widespread, but however you won't find them in your bones or your central nervous system, but everywhere else in your body they're actually quite elaborately spreaded. And since the system actually lacks a pump, the returning of the fluid is very much dependent on the active skeletal muscle movements that actually produce a kind of milking action to help fluid move, and also with the presence of valves within these vessels that actually help prevent any backflow and ensures lymph flows in a unidirectional manner. So a lot of other factors also can help your lymph flow through the lymphatic vessel, like changes in pressure during breathing, especially in the area of your thorax, and also the pulsating action of nearby arteries, because lymphatics are usually bundled together in connective tissue sheets along with all your blood vessels. So the pulsating action of arteries actually help lymph to actually move through the lymphatic vessel as well. So in addition to that, the larger lymphatic vessels like your trunks and ducts, they have structures similar to your veins. So they have three tunics, so they're going to have one tunic, the tunica media, with which is going to consist of smooth muscles, and because there is smooth muscles in this wall, these are going to be able to contract rhythmically to help to pump the lymph along. But as you know, the major factor that contributes to lymph fluid movement in our body is actually the skeletal muscle contraction and movement, and that is why it is very important to have a good physical activity to actually encourage the flow of your lymph. So what makes your lymphatic capillaries so unique that they are so permeable to, suck up all this interstitial fluid is it has two unique structural modification. And the first one is its cells, or what we know as the endothelial cells that form the walls of these capillaries. They are actually overlapping against each other, in which the overlap area actually forms like a valve, which is known as the mini valves. So this pattern is like something like your rooftop. If you look at the house, you have roof, which is like the tiles are arranged one on top of another, overlapping each other. So it's something like that, the overlapping pattern of the endothelial cells that uniquely produces this mini valves. And the second feature of your lymphatic capillary that makes it very unique and is able to do its function is it has these collagen filaments that actually anchor all these cells to the surrounding tissues, so that will prevent the cells from actually collapsing when there are changes in the pressure due to the interstitial fluid that is coming in and out. So this is a lymphatic vessel. So when you say it's blind-ended, so this is a blind-ended vessel. So you can see that, that's the end. There is no continuation. So all these blind ends will actually occur somewhere at the capillary beds, where the fluid eventually enters into the vessel. And you can see the overlapping arrangement of the endothelial cell here. They actually overlap each other, and also all these like root-like projections that you're seeing here. These are all the anchoring filament, the collagen filament that actually anchors the cells into to the surrounding tissues. Okay, so the overlapping of the cells eventually produce what we know as the mini valves. So this is another image which shows you the arrangement of these cells within the capillaries, and you can see that there is always a gap between two cells because they are not tightly joined, so the adjacents of the cells actually overlapping each other very loosely, forming what we know as the mini valves. So here you can actually see a mini valve in the histology image of the capillary. Okay, in this image you can literally appreciate how fluid gets into your lymphatic vessels and not get out from it. So what happens is when there's an increase in pressure in the interstitial space, so this is going to push against your endothelial cells. So when it pushes, then it's going to cause the cells to move inwards. So the valves are actually going to be open, the flaps are going to open, so fluid is eventually going to just flow in. So always remember, interstitial fluid, you can find a lot of water, glucose, amino acid, electrolytes, and even white blood cells, because white blood cells are capable of squeezing their way out of your blood capillaries. They also enter into the lymphatic vessel. However, you will not find red blood cells and platelet in the interstitial fluid or in the lymphatic vessel, because these are structures that are too big to come out from the blood capillary. Okay, so back to this image, you can see that once fluid has filled in, because the valves has opened, increase in pressure outside, valves open, fluid goes in, and cells do not collapse against each other because you have all the anchoring collagen filaments that are holding the cells from collapsing against each other. So once fluid enters inside, so you move on to the next image, pressure in the inside, the interstitial pressure in the inside the lymph, now it's known as a lymph already. Once it enters, the fluid enters the lymph vessels, it is known as a lymph. So the pressure in the capillary is increased, so that's going to force against all these endothelial cells, causing the flaps to close against each other, so all the mini valves get shut, and at the same time your collagen filaments are also holding the cells so that they don't get pushed away or gets collapsed towards the surrounding structures. So this eventually cause the fluid to be contained within the vessel itself. Okay, so it's going to prevent leaking of the lymph, and also the valve. As you know, valves, their main function is to prevent backflow, so the valves in the capillary is also going to help you prevent any backflow of the lymph, and eventually ensures that the lymph flow is in a one-way direction back to your heart. If you remember, I did mention that one of the functions of your lymphatic system is transporting fat to the circulatory system, and this is highly possible because of the presence of a very specialized lymphatic capillary that is present in the finger-like projections or the villi of your intestinal mucosa, known as the lacteal. Okay, so that's the special name for these lymphatic capillaries that we find in our small intestine. So they play a major role in absorbing digested fats from the intestine. So fats are actually very large molecules, so they are unable to cross your blood vessels. So larger size molecules are easily absorbed into the lymphatic capillaries, and in this case it's the lacteal, since it's happening at your small intestine. So the fluid that is absorbed into the lacteal are very rich in fat, and this fatty lymph is really white, milky white in color, and it is what we call as the chyle. So the fluid in the lacteal is not called a lymph, but it is called a chyle. Okay, so this chyle is then eventually delivered to the blood via the lymphatic stream, and this is how you actually get fat added into your blood. From the lymphatic capillaries, lymph is now eventually going to flow into larger collecting vessels, and then finally to the trunks and the ducts. So the flow is always the same. From the smaller capillaries, we are going to move to the collecting vessels, then the trunks and ducts. So as the lymph moves through the vessels, the structure of your lymphatic vessels are getting much larger in size. So here we're going to look at the collecting lymphatic vessels, in which they have almost similar structure as the veins. You will find the same 3 tunica layers that you find in the veins in this vessel. However, these vessels are very much thinner compared to a vein, but they have more internal valves. Okay, so there's more valves, but less. The walls are much thinner. So the exact anatomical distribution of the lymphatic vessel varies greatly between individuals, even more than the number of veins that we have. From the collecting vessels, lymph will now actually flow into the lymphatic trunk. So if you see the order from the capillary to the vessels and now to the trunk. Okay, so we're not going to talk about the lymph nodes that they're passing through, because that's going to be in a separate section. So we're going to look at the vessels only for now. So now we have entered into the trunks. So all these large collecting vessels will drain into one of the 5 major trunks that we have in our body. So the trunks actually drain from large areas of our body and are mostly named by the regions from which they collect the lymph from. So we have 5 major trunks, in which 4 of them actually occur in pairs on the right side and 1 on the left side of the body. Okay, so these are the lumbar trunk, okay, which is going to drain from your lower limb, And then you have the bronchomediastinal trunk that is going to drain from your thoracic and mediastinal area. From the name bronchomediastinal, you should have an idea that this is going to be somewhere near your thoracic and mediastinum area. Then you have the subclavian trunk, which is going to drain from the upper limb. And finally, the jugular trunk that is going to drain from your head region. So all these four trunks are actually occurring in pairs. So you have one on the draining for the left side of your body and one to drain from your right side of your body. And you have one more which is known as the intestinal trunk that's going to drain all the lymph from your intestinal area. But this one is only going to occur in a singular form. So you only have one of them. They don't occur in a pair. So the lymph eventually moves from the 5 major trunks that we just looked at into one of the 2 large ducts that we have in our thoracic region. So the lymph now is going to be delivered into one of these 2 large ducts, which is either going to be the right lymphatic duct or the much larger thoracic duct. So the right lymphatic duct drains from the right upper limb, your right side of your hands, shoulders, your right side of your head, and the right side of your thorax region, while the much larger thoracic duct actually receives lymph from the rest of the body. So the thoracic duct actually arises anteriorly around the first 2 lumbar vertebrae as an enlarged sac known as cisterna chyli, which collects lymph from the 2 large lumbar trunk as well as the intestinal trunk. So each duct will eventually empty its lymph into the venous circulation at the junction of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein on its respective side. That means the right lymphatic duct will empty at the junction of the internal jugular vein and subclavian vein on the right side, whereas the thoracic duct will empty it on the left side. Okay, this is going to recap the entire flow of your lymph in its major trunks and ducts. So we're not going to look at the vessels and capillaries because there's just too many of them, but we're just going to look at the trunks and the ducts in this particular image to understand how lymph is actually eventually returned back to your venous circulation. Okay, let's start with the very lower part, which is the lumbar trunk. So you have one on your right over here and one on your left, which is eventually going to drain lymph from the structures of your lower limb. That means your lower legs, your pelvis area, so it's going to drain lymph from the lower part of your body. And then you also have the intestinal trunk over here in the middle, which is bringing in lymph that is absorbed from the intestinal region. These structures, the lymph trunks, the right lumbar and left lumbar and the intestinal trunk, are going to eventually drain into cisterna chyli. If you remember, cisterna chyli is the enlarged sac that eventually your thoracic duct is going to arise from. So they're all draining into this structure known as cisterna chyli. Okay, moving on, you have the other 2 trunks, which is the bronchomediastinal trunks on the left and right side. So the bronchomediastinal trunks are going to drain lymph from your thoracic and mediastinal area. And then further up, you have your right subclavian and your left subclavian trunks that are bringing in lymph from the upper part of your body, which is your shoulder regions, your arms. These are going to drain into the subclavian trunks. And finally, from the head region, you have your right and left jugular trunk. So all these trunks are eventually going to drain either into the thoracic duct, which is over here. So this is the thoracic duct, which is going to drain all the lymph from the rest of the body except for the ones from your right side of your head, your right subclavian and the right thoracic. So the ones from these trunks, these are all going to drain into the right lymphatic duct over here. Okay, so the thoracic duct is actually quite much larger compared to the right lymphatic duct, and both this duct is going to empty their content at the junction of the jugular vein, This is the internal jugular vein and this is the subclavian vein. So you can see there's a junction here. This is where the trunks are going to come and empty their content. So the one on the left side is going to be taken up by the thoracic duct. It's going to go all the way up and empty in this junction, whereas the right lymphatic duct is going to empty its content on the right side of the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein here. And then eventually lymph is now returned into the veins, so they are already in the circulatory system, and these veins are going to go in as superior vena cava and back into your heart.